Hi everyone. For those of you that haven't met me before, my name's Jayne Croft and I am an associate in the corporate team in our Liverpool office at Napthens. We have been putting on a series of face-to-face virtual events to sort of have a catch up with some of our local leaders in the city region, and I am delighted today to be joined by Maggie O'Carroll, who is the CEO of the Women's Organisation. I am actually on the board of the Women's Organisation, which is how we know each other. I've been on the board for 4 years now. Time flies. So Maggie, as I say, is the CEO of the Women's Organisation. I believe it was set up in 1991 originally, so 1996 was changed 2000, and then eventually became the Women's Organisation. And I think it's pretty difficult to actually say in a nutshell what the Women's Organisation does. So to sort of narrow it down slightly, we've got employment, enterprise and wellbeing support, business incubation, programme management, consultancy, research and influence. And I've stolen this from the Women's Org website, Maggie. So it says, you were involved in shaping women's economic development policy on a local, national and international basis.
Yes, I suppose that's what I'm involved with, yes. Yeah.
The best nutshell we can do.
Absolutely, I thought that was a very good summary, Jayne.
So in October, you launched the Rethinking the Economy report for an inclusive and sustainable future. What exactly was it that prompted you at the Women's Organisation to put this report together?
Well, firstly, thank you very much for your kind invitation to come and talk with you today, and your continued support as a trustee for the charity and the trading arm of the Women's Organisation. Helped guide us through choppy waters, and indeed we're certainly there now in terms of small businesses and people's livelihoods and communities around Liverpool City region, nationally and internationally. And I suppose one of the things that we're particularly interested in is that as an organisation, and as you know, is that in order to be able to have real seismic change and progress in terms of equality, diversity, but also economic inclusion, one of the things is around actually having an evidence base and about having robust research and to inform local and national policy. And obviously one of the things that we've always been sort of committed to is to working with our colleagues within the academic community and gathering the evidence from our day-to-day delivery and our experience of that. But I suppose putting that alongside other research that has been produced by the academic and the research community, the scholarly community. And then, but primarily in order to be able to focus it on and emphasize it on where targeted, I suppose, where women are working, women are potentially underrepresented, or areas that are actually particularly relevant for women in terms of their I suppose their economic and their social inclusion. So that's why we decided that the launch of the report was important and a timely one, because there was a lot of discussion at that stage about recovery. Yeah. I don't think we're there yet. No. And there was also about a lot of discussion about the comprehensive spending review, about what the government should invest in going forward. And we felt that it was important to put the evidence in front of government and in front of local and combined authorities to get a voice out there for women.
So if we sort of go back a little bit before sort of March of this year, then it's fair to say that as a city region, we were doing pretty well for ourselves. We were on a growth trajectory, and the report actually says we were the most productive city region in the north. But there is a flip side to this as well, and at the women's organisation, we are very aware of this. There's a lot of socioeconomic factors and challenges that we are faced with. Do you just want to set the scene a little bit in terms of those socioeconomic challenges that we are seeing, or we still are seeing, I suppose, but were sort of in play before pandemic?
Yeah. I think one of the critical things is to recognise is that, you know, obviously Liverpool City Region has and continues to, you know, had over a number of decades suffered, you know, some economic challenges. And the fact of the matter is that, you know, our economy was struggling in terms of the numbers of business starts, the numbers of people unemployed, for example, and also those people that were, I suppose, having difficulty getting into the labour market in the first place. And so as a consequence, one of the things that has you know, one of the focuses has been over the last couple of decades has been very much about growing the economy. And that actually was happening and there was quite a lot of success in relation to it. And the fact of the matter was is that what we were seeing Liverpool experiencing a renaissance. Now that renaissance wasn't actually felt by everybody in Liverpool City Region. And I think it's important to remember that. We still had very high, and we continue to have very high incidences of social and economic deprivation. We have some of the worst health inequalities in the country. So it isn't, whilst there was progress was being made, what we must recognise is that that progress was really only being felt by a proportion of the population. Women were still at a disadvantage, Black and ethnic minorities were at a disadvantage, and the other aspects are like disabled people, etc., etc. And we did have a lot of economic inactivity or people that were perhaps not participating in the labour market due to ill health. So whilst the story was positive on the one hand, it still, there was a lot more to be done, shall we say.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was really interesting, actually. I read in the report that after the 2008 recession, there was a big increase in self-employed people, and the report actually says it was a little bit worrying because it was at the lower end of the skills. But do you think that we could see this again after this COVID-induced recession?
Well, what I think is I think the evidence is very clear that after the last recession in 2008, it was a small business led recovery. And the fact of the matter is that there is no reason to believe that that's not going to be the same trajectory or the same pathway that we're going to experience in relation to the economic recovery post-COVID. Now, obviously, the uncertainty lies about actually how COVID plays out, because we're already seeing this kind of undulating and ever-changing and uncertain sort of process in terms of actually getting on top of the pandemic, responding to it effectively, and actually, you know, out with it, the vaccine is about actually how do we, I suppose, how do we address the issue of the pandemic and the fallout of the pandemic. But there's no doubt that the evidence is all pointing to that, you know, even today, we would see, you know, issues of business startups being taken on, or we've seen business startups being created. Even during the pandemic, we're seeing a rise in business startups, and we have no reason that that's not going to continue.
So I've seen there's a lot of talk on social media, especially on Twitter, about the self-employed people, freelancers, and that kind of being forgotten about, essentially, in terms of the support provided by the government. Do you think that could impact on the number of self-employed businesses going forward? Do you think that could discourage people?
I think, you know, the fact of the matter is that there will be always I think there'll always be a situation where individuals will see themselves as taking the plunge because there will be necessity. They won't have an option. There won't be that number of jobs. Now, that's not a great situation in terms of I suppose that's not a great situation in terms of people being, entrepreneurship being the right fit for them. But having said that, what it sometimes does is that when we've got periods of redundancy, and when we've got periods of as you say, recession, and there are a lot of job losses, there are people that are actually move out of or take that as the opportunity, saying, I don't have any other choice. And it leads to the burgeoning of a number of very highly successful businesses and entrepreneurs. So these are entrepreneurs that didn't even know that they had entrepreneurial tendencies until they were actually pushed there. But having said that, what we don't want is we don't want sort of throngs and throngs of people starting up a business to, because they feel like it's the only choice, the only option open to them, when in actual fact, business and starting a business isn't for everybody. And we want them to start good, sustainable businesses, and businesses that actually will, I suppose, businesses that will help them do or make a decent living for themselves, that will have potential for growth and also potential for employment.
So at Napthens, obviously I'm in the corporate team, and we were supporting a lot of clients from March onwards with helping them to access the financial support. So mostly bounce back loans and CBILS as well. And the CBILS, and in the start, were quite difficult to get access to. We had some clients that needed to get their MPs involved and everything. I was actually looking at some statistics last night, and the British Business Bank have handed out over £40 billion in bounce back loans. So that there's been a lot of help out there, but do you think that the support that has been given to small businesses, not just financial, do you think that's been enough during lockdown?
Well, I think at the big, you've got to give credit where credit's due in terms of basically saying this was a real, it was a tsunami of need that was required very quickly. Absolutely. So, ultimately to try and get those sort of systems in place, up and running very, very quickly, I think, was a humongous job. And in real terms, there are checks and balances that need to be made in relation to that. What I do feel is that there probably was an error right from the outset, insofar as that if you're asking a banking institution to take any element of risk, which may hit their bottom line and their profits, on potential risky propositions, then clearly that was going to always cause difficulty. So I think the government's expectation to say that banks were going to change their, sort of spots, shall we say, overnight, that wasn't going to happen. So I think that the design right from the outset might have been, unrealistic, shall we say. I think the other thing was that, as per usual, not all things are homogenous. Not all businesses are homogenous. So consequently, infrastructure simply isn't right for some businesses. They just simply didn't need that level of resource, etc., etc. And I think the process, of course, is that you couldn't, if you're trying to get something done quickly, the usual kind of processes in terms of what financial institutions that will go through, you needed to have some mechanism to be able to perhaps make those processes accessible on the one hand, but obviously mitigate against fraud or protect against fraud on the other hand. So I don't think it was quite as straightforward. I think and I think it would be easy to criticize, and I have been critical of it. But what I would say is that
wouldn't expect anything less, Maggie.
Well, I think it's important. There were some very, very profitable businesses that were at the cusp of going under because they simply just they couldn't get their hands on the resources. And I think they needed to have that addressed. And there's a whole swathe of businesses that were in trouble anyway, long before the pandemic kicked in.
It's just
balancing. Yes. Yeah. So all in all, I think the bounce back loans, I think again what we're seeing is that we're seeing that they did provide a very useful and a very important tool. I think my greatest concern, however, is has been about the area of freelancers, as you said, and the areas of people that are newly self-employed. How could they fall out? You know, the simple fact is that directors are indeed the forgotten, and there's over 2 million of them, and fundamentally they are employers, they are entrepreneurs, they are the creators and the deliverers of services. And so consequently, I can't believe that we're still having that conversation, and government don't seem to be listening, and that's very unfortunate. So I think the system was imperfect, but you know, what I would say is that I would hope during this lockdown that we've learned from the first in March, and that actually we can get those measures in place. But like I say, I also think that, you know, the 80% furlough arrangement, right and proper, it should have been there for all of the tier 2s and tier 3s areas. And I think the national lockdown has given people a little bit of relief in relation to it. But all of this sort of chopping and changing is absolutely, it's deadly for business insofar as it's not good. It doesn't seem to be delivering anything in terms of reducing the impact of the spread of the pandemic. And the other thing is that, so it's not working in any way, shape or form. So I'm really hopeful that this, you know, I would have liked to have seen a circuit breaker, you know, back in September when it was originally being mooted. I think that would have been far more sensible. And
it would have made a lot of sense to tie in with the half term and all that kind of thing. So,
well, you know, the science, if we're being led by science, let's be led by science. And the scientists were saying it then. So, you know, that's all I would say in relation to that. I'm not the Prime Minister.
We'll save all the politics for another time.
Indeed. Yeah.
So obviously, in terms of the sort of specific women element of this, and I think actually yesterday was the day in the year that women essentially started working for free, 2nd of November. So I just want to focus now on the impact of the pandemic that's had on women. So in the report, it says that they're 47% more likely than men to lose their jobs, and 14% more likely to have been furloughed. Obviously, there's that sort of link that we can't stay away from, that there are many women working in the hospitality industry, and it's been one of the worst hit sectors. And then the other issue, obviously, was in terms of at the very start of lockdown, when all the schools were closed, women were expected to work from home, educate kids, do everything, be a million things all at once, like it wasn't hard enough already. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, you know, I at the beginning of lockdown, I had the opportunity to have some focus groups on Zoom with women who were running their own business, who were parents, and were you know, reporting that effectively now they had become, you know, chief childcare, chief you know, entrepreneur, and also chief homemaker. So now they have 3 jobs. And the other thing is that in actual fact, then they had, you know, then there was other responsibilities in terms of perhaps grandparents, etc., or other care responsibilities. So it added. So they no longer just have the 2 jobs, but they actually have 4 jobs. And then we asked the question, and then I said, so are you sure you've only got 4 jobs? And I said, well, what about, you know, the teacher job? So they became teachers as well. So they became educators. So, you know, honestly, at every level, I think, you know, what a pasting the community of women, and 52% of the population have had. And so effectively, that has just been you know, hugely difficult. It has created such pressure on those entrepreneurs. And the other aspect is that even, you know, women that are, you know, women that are working and employed women, full stop, end of story, have had a sort of phenomenal difficulty and have faced those challenges. You know, multiple jobs now they have, and they're still getting paid less, and they were more likely to be furloughed. And the furlough would say, well, isn't that a good thing? Obviously they had time off, etc., etc. Yeah, but they were only, being furloughed at the 80%. If a man was being furloughed, the percentage, which escapes me at the moment, but you were more likely, if you were a man, to be furloughed at 100% of your salary. So,
Right.
at every level, women were actually being disadvantaged. And now what we have is we're seeing a situation where women now are facing, redundancies in terms of a weakened economy. Women are actually going to, at the forefront. And it's not, and then that, if you couple that with women from Black and ethnic minority communities, then you really see an absolute gaping hole emerge in relation to the support and also the opportunities. So they're more likely to, be impacted in terms of catching COVID, and then because of the nature of the jobs that they do, and then on top of that, then they've got all of these other elements too. So whilst more men were dying from COVID at the early, the health data is telling us, at every other level, the fact of the matter is that women economically and socially the pressure was being piled on there, and that hasn't changed, I'm afraid.
No. And then to add to that as well, there's also the mental health problem of actually dealing with the fact that you're in the middle of a global pandemic that we've never ever come across anything else like in our lifetime.
No, and I think that in itself, it's like, parents, to be fair to parents, it's like they're watching their children, their children's lives are being, horribly and terribly impacted in relation to this, in terms of their, the opportunities for them to grow up and to actually, sort of play and be, educated and access and have a freedom, shall we say, has been taken from them. And of course, now we're coming into a situation where it's like, I never thought, I think as an Irish person, we've always been obsessed with the weather. But now the weather is absolutely, it's a must now, because, however bad it was during the summer, and obviously in March and April and May, we had decent weather and throughout the summer. Now we're moving into the dark nights of winter. And I think those are, this is, absolutely a ticking time bomb in terms of not people just being excluded from work and, and being, taken away from their routines, etc., etc. Now we have people, working in very close quarters at home. They're trying to educate, children while children are still at school. Over the period, we don't know what's going to happen in terms of schools. There's a possibility that they may close. If that's the case, then we're back to I think, it's really ramping up the impact on mental health and women's and families in general.
Absolutely. No, and obviously not helped by the fact that we're now about to go into lockdown Mark 2, which is also not ideal. So I'm just going to go back to it. In the report, you've focused on 4 main sectors: so social enterprise, self-employment and micro-business, care, and the green economy. And the comment that you made before about the weather is quite interesting, actually, because one of the things I wanted to ask you is, obviously during lockdown, when it first started, it was March, April, May, we all became very acutely aware that we needed our open spaces. We had our Boris approved 1 hour of exercise a day. And I've got quite a big garden, so I felt really lucky because I had somewhere to go and sit outside that was safe and it was just for me. And I really felt for the people who lived in city centres, people who lived in apartments where they didn't necessarily have access to that open space. And obviously, if you're in a city, that is even more prevalent. So how important is the green economy to us to building back better? Can we just pause it for a second, cut this bit out? The dog's about to start whinging, so I just need to let him in the garden. So just hold that thought and we'll edit this bit out.
Okay.
Otherwise there'll be wolf noises. I could see him by the door getting ready to start whinging. Do you want me to ask that question again?
Okay, no, that's fine. So Jayne, I think the green economy is absolutely fundamental. It's fundamental for a whole variety of reasons, but let's start with, it's the right thing to do. It's the smart thing to do, in terms of, actually, we now recognize, and it's taken a global pandemic, I think, to recognize about the importance of quality of life measures, in terms of green spaces, in terms of the opportunity not to perhaps be flying. Our air miles have reduced, the kind of industrial output. So, it has given us an insight, hasn't it, into what can be done in relation to, the walking to work. And there is obviously a risk, because now people want to, the private space of a car, within a pandemic, you don't really want to be taking public transport, etc., etc. But having said that, I think it has given us an insight into what is possible in terms of cycle lanes. It's also given the emphasis, or the impetus, to do something. So we actually now have sort of investment in these kind of initiatives, really, which are which are very sort of green focused. But we can't sit in our laurels in relation to this. We must move on and progress on, and continue with speed, and be far more ambitious than we have been. Because there's two reasons. Firstly, climate change is still rocking on, and still an area of huge concern. You're still killing the planet, and effectively, it doesn't make any sense to kill the planet, because obviously we're trying to live on the planet. But the other thing is that it's not good business to kill the planet either. So the idea of actually thinking in innovative terms, it will be of benefit, economic benefit, not just the social benefit and the environmental benefit, but it will be economic benefit in terms of new ways of working, deploying new technologies, deploying new sort of approaches to building, for example. The idea and the notion of greening every public building. We will need a massive amount of what I would describe as large-scale infrastructure, and why not put it in with the green credentials, plus, right at the heart of it. Effectively, if we're going to restart our economy, we're going to recover from this, let's do anything that we're doing. Let's not be just building roads and building bridges, etc., etc., but actually let's be doing everything that is green led, and that will create jobs. It will future-proof or it will reduce carbon emissions, and it will also create I suppose places which are better, and I suppose better places to live and work. So it's our push for the green economy is the fact that it will create jobs. It will do good things while it's creating jobs. It'll create economic output. But the other thing about it is it's the right thing to do, and it's a smart thing to do. So why not do it? But we really are going to have to be ambitious about it.
I think a lot of people as well, especially at the start of lockdown, a lot of people had more time on their hands just to think about things like this and think about the impact of them. I think there's been I'm hearing a lot more people. I mean, obviously, because we had the time on their hands, a lot of people have got fit. They've got into good habits because they've had that extra time to break old routines and bad habits. Think about what they're eating more. Think about where the food comes from. So it has really, and obviously there was, pollution, air pollution, noise pollution everywhere. It was nice and quiet. Well, the roads, there wasn't as many cars on the road, and it was lovely. So people have had that little snapshot of what it could be like.
Well, this notion of the 15-minute city, it's like you are within, 15 minutes of everything that you need. And the idea of, with respect to, the need to get things delivered is one thing. But the fact of the matter is most of us are within local walking distance of shops. Let's walk there. The other thing is that, do we have to be constantly putting money in the pockets of large corporates that probably would have questionable tax arrangements around the globe? Do we need to continually make the owner and chief executive of Amazon richer than he already is? Probably not. So, consumer behavior does really, and does need to have, time to actually sort of reset the clock on that. And you're absolutely right. People, we're all, and we can all sort of like reflect on this, is the fact that we've been busy running around and thinking about what next, and and our very busy lives. But the reality is that lockdown maybe has been an opportunity to actually sort of rethink and reset our thinking in terms of actually how do we live our lives, and what's important. And I think the idea of localism is absolutely crucial. The idea of buying your Christmas presents locally, not putting the pound in the international. Well, it'll probably end up in the Bahamas or someplace like that. Yeah.
But that was exactly where I was going next with this, to be honest. I mean, there's a lot on social media, and even on the Women's Org social media, a lot of people are wanting to stick behind our local businesses as well while we go into this new lockdown. There is a really big encouragement, and I don't think people need encouraging anyway, to be honest, because I think most people are thinking that way. But buy from a small business, buy from a local business. How do you see the next couple of months panning out in terms of city centres? Because there is a bit of a footfall had increased, hadn't it? Sort of July, August, September, and then it's decreased again. And I know when I've been into our Liverpool office, throughout all of it, to be honest, the business district is very, very quiet. How does that affect on things?
I mean, I think it does, like anything, I think we need to sort of rethink our city centres. And we need to, rethink about,
what we use them for.
Yes. If we're talking about, shopping locally, and we're talking about, perhaps investing in, local specialist shops. You go to many of the European, our continental European country, other neighbours, such as Italy, such as France, such as Spain, they have maintained those local shops in those very, in every town and village across those countries. And so consequently, and they get their supplies locally as well, particularly in relation to food, and and the food miles are certainly much more limited there than they are here. And so I think we need to have a complete rethink of towns and cities in terms of actually how they're designed and what they're there for. And the reality of the big giant stores, I'm not sure that they will come back or they will be maintained. And the question is that is it a good thing that they, that kind of model of consumerism continues? Perhaps not. I think effectively what we could have is that, people are recognizing that health and well-being, the idea of arts and culture, those things are far more important now to people, and they're being recognized as such. So for me, I would see a complete revamping, and I would have every area. I would say to, some of those landlords are going to just have to basically, I don't know, they're going to have to remodel, but I think the remodeling should be around the basis of making, those spaces be far more focused towards the arts and cultural sector. And I think the arts and cultural sector are absolutely the ones, those artists and creators are absolutely the ones that would actually, revive city centres, but not in the traditional sense. Not about coming in and shopping till you drop, but more about coming in and experiencing in a new sense entirely. So that's what I would say. I don't think it's going to come back as it is. If it does, it's going to take a long time. I don't think it probably should in its current format. And I would say I would like to see a complete, I suppose, change of purpose, shall we say, and move away from the consumer of things to the consumer of ideas and the consumer of experiences.
No, it's with so many negatives and so many bad things coming through. It's nice to have that sort of positive thing. That's just something that we could actually look forward to in the future, definitely.
Well, I think that even now, I think that the arts and cultural sector a lot of practitioners and organizations have switched their activities to online. We've been able to attend, events and festivals and all sorts of things that we probably wouldn't have been able to do previously, without actually putting on our coat and going out and, sort of getting in our cars and doing all those type of things.
Lockdown Zoom quizzes can stay though. They can stay in the past.
I think
everything else
right.
is fine. They can go.
Yeah. I think there is a place for the collective party face to face. I do think a Zoom with any more than 3 people or 4 people on it gets a bit,
you get lost,
particularly with the red wine or with a glass of wine. I think then you're hiding to nothing really in relation to that.
So one of the other sectors that you cover in the report is the care sector.
Yes.
And obviously the pandemic's been a real pressure on something that was already under-resourced and underfunded. You would have to have been living under a rock really to not be aware of the problems with the NHS and also funding for care homes as well. I know there's been a lot in the local press lately on some of our local care homes and funding. Well, there's been a campaign now and funding's back again now, which is great news. And the resource levels are at national and local level as well, aren't they? So what do we need to do to get it where it needs to be?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the line drawn for us is very much that the care infrastructure that is provided through or supported by the NHS tends to be reasonably stable and reasonably well paid, and the terms and conditions are good. I think the difficulty is local government are faced with an absolutely impossible position and situation in terms of, the resource that's been made available through local government for the provision of the likes of domiciliary care and enabling people to stay in their own houses and other types of specialist care simply is just completely and utterly underfunded. Full stop, end of story. It's undervalued, it's underfunded, and the notion that, and it's primarily implemented and delivered by women. And the fact of the matter is that, a lot of these contracts are, it's simply not possible to pay living wage and the real living wage, because there's living wage and the real living wage. And ultimately, there isn't enough emphasis and there's not enough notice and there's not enough priority set or given to this particular sector, that without it, without being able to maintain people in their own homes and particularly elderly people, simply the whole system would fall apart. So for me, I would see a complete and utter revamp of that being required. I honestly think that we have to, stop separating social care with that. We need to give it sort of an equity between that's being provided in the healthcare, in terms of hospitals or in terms of what we would know as the traditional NHS. I think we shouldn't have it separated. I think we need to have it all integrated into one and under the auspices. I think in radical terms, I think it needs to be under the auspices of the NHS, because fundamentally, I think, when it's been separated and don't get me wrong, some local governments have been absolutely superb. I mean, for example, Janet Williamson in the Wirral has led the agenda to actually get the care sector and the employees paid at living wage on the Wirral. It is possible, but what else has to be cut somewhere else? So for me, I think a complete revamp, it needs to be completely not just reviewed, because no point to do, you've got to do something, and that's about professional. You need to be able to give it the I suppose the necessary kind of notice and also priority within planning, and you need to give it the same amount or the correct amount of investment as well. But the other thing is that these people are, people are going into people's homes. They are so important. Who would you want to be looking after your mum or your dad or your auntie or whatever, your granny? I mean, fundamentally, these are very important roles undertaken by people that are really, really committed, let's really show them the respect, and let's actually give them the equity and the respect that they would if they were a nurse in a hospital. And at the moment, they simply don't have that. That system is just treated as a second-class system, and that for that we're calling for a complete revamp.
I agree. So we've touched on this a couple of times, but we've not really sort of gone into depth on it. So there's a lot of emphasis on recovery, and in the report, obviously, you say, well, actually, we're not out of the woods yet, so we need to talk about getting out of it before we can actually talk about recovery, which is even more important now when we're staring down the barrel of lockdown too.
Yes.
There's not going to be a one size fits all approach, is there? You know, we're not, as a country, we're not just going to be recovered within a set amount of time. Different regions are going to recover. There'll be different pockets, I think, that'll be recovering at different speeds. Realistically, what are we looking at in terms of recovery for the Liverpool City region economy?
Well, I think one of the things we have to sort of recognize, one of the things, it's like the second lockdown or the second phase and the second spike, it shouldn't be a surprise. Government and the scientists told us about that in March and April, saying that they were expecting one in October. So here it is, October, November. And so consequently, the idea and the notion that we were starting to talk about recovery so early on in the process was troubling, and has continued to be troubling for me and for this organization, because the fact of the matter is that the things you will do for, dealing to stop the hemorrhaging of jobs and to stop the hemorrhaging of economic activity, that's where the priority needs to be still. So for me, it isn't about recovery. It's about actually stemming the tide of job losses, stemming the tide of business losses, and making sure that we're shoring that up. And so I think in terms of recovery, we need to start. We do need to think about recovery. We need to start shaping recovery. But let's make sure that we don't have the cart before the horse here, because effectively, what we're going to be, or what we're looking to do, is we're looking to make sure that we try and have minimize loss and impact right now. And if you do that, therefore, the recovery won't be such a sort of an uphill struggle.
Yeah.
Now, in terms of when, I'd love to be able to I'd love to be able to tell you the outcome of the election in the United States. I'd love to be able to tell you the numbers in the lottery, but my feeling is that this will be dependent upon actually how science and how the scientists get on in terms of actually finding a vaccine, and also the test and trace process that we have in place. Because if you look at the likes of New Zealand and Australia now have not had their COVID clear, and I think New Zealand are exactly the same. They've taken, and they're island nations as well, so they've taken quite decisive action in terms of actually the health, actually getting the health and the science right. And so consequently, their economies have not had the kind of absolute pasting that our economies and the European economies have had. So I think it'll be dependent on those things, about how vaccine, and also, vaccine's a longer term thing, but certainly test and trace, about how we get on top and how we manage the spread of the virus. And then, of course, I don't like to mention it, but it's not all pandemic. We've got Brexit as well.
Yeah, that is still very much
so. And that's like, that is the quagmire of whatever, because
you bring that up.
Well, I'm sorry, but if you're talking about recovery, you can't talk about one and not the other. That's the way it is. It's like, usually if we're going to have systems where we're going to have 7-hour waits at Dover, because that's going to be problematic. And we won't even talk about financial services or doing business like you probably are, an international basis. Can you imagine if we haven't got, the deal organized, and we haven't got the basics and the fundamentals for the financial services, the service industry? It's going to be, I think it'll make the pandemic a walk in the park, honestly. So all good news from me here. Sorry, I do apologize.
I mean, it does kind of feel like it's happening in the background, and it's snuck up on us a little bit, because people have been so distracted by the pandemic. So I think it's going to hit hard when it does all kick in.
Well, yes, and I think part of the thing is that, obviously the pandemic is part and parcel of the narrative, and so it should be, because this is people's lives. And this is, and it's global. But the reality is that, on top of the global aspects, the UK have got Brexit on top of that. So, and if we're Brexit would have been hard regardless. So you combine those things, and it's like, it is really kind of it's a nasty cocktail, I think.
Yeah, 100%. So have you, as quite a big stakeholder in the city region, have you been able to have much input on decisions that have been made, in terms of, we've had this, it's quite well publicised, that the Metro mayors in Manchester and Liverpool were very unhappy with what was offered by the government in terms of financial support when we went into Tier 3. Were you able to have any involvement in that?
Well, ultimately, we make an attempt to have a voice at many, many tables, and I mean, sometimes it's and it's obviously we want to have a constructive and a considered input, and I think, and hopefully we do that. I mean, obviously you've got, you refer to the report. That's one of the areas that has been welcomed by many stakeholders that have said that it's it offers an alternative approach to just, when we're talking about building back better, it's not just about building roads, and it's about people focused and areas that actually where you can get greatest impact. And I think, it has been welcomed by civil servants and colleagues in Whitehall that are actually policymakers. I think, more locally, I think what we do have is that we've got a situation where, of course, we're in constant contact, and I've got colleagues that are working, on an individual basis with, or talking with, the combined authority and the offices of the combined authority. So there is a sort of, I suppose, an open dialogue there. And I think, to be fair to everybody, one of the things is that there's a lot of demands and needs, and everyone's got their own, kind of like saying, well, this is what's massively important. I think we're trying to take a strategic approach to it, in terms of basically, providing that kind of robust evidence base to say, actually, this isn't, it's not just always about women, but even though they are 52% of the population, but these are areas, these are our four key areas that actually have robust economic and social outcomes. And so, we're inviting you to think outside the box, because we need to think outside the box, and here's the evidence to do so. So yes, we hold a place on the National Growth Board for Structural Funds, where we are in constant liaison with government. We do publish quite a bit in terms of using social media and briefing papers, and obviously we're on calls monthly and ad hoc calls with the combined authority. So I think we're doing, and obviously I do write to the leaders of the local various local authorities, asking for their support and pointing out particular areas that potentially don't need to be as complicated, or how they can help and intervene. So we have been very, very involved in that. Whether I think we have had I think some success in relation to recovery grants being made available to people that haven't been that are not direct ratepayers. We're currently working with the Combined Authority on a self-employment initiative. an additional self-employment initiative. So there are things that we certainly are part and parcel of the conversation. But like I say, it's a crowded field in terms of chat out there. So we like to just take a few critical initiatives and actually focus on those and assist our colleagues from policy, but also in terms of practice and implementation. So it has been, put it this way, we have been rather engaged in the whole process, and we certainly haven't been sitting back in our laurels in relation to it.
So, with the tier system, obviously there was a lot of, I saw a lot of comments on social media, kind of saying, Liverpool's been the guinea pig for being the first one into tier 3. This morning checked the news, and now we're the guinea pig for mass testing. How do you think that all this has been dealt with? I mean, there was quite a different approach between Liverpool and Manchester, and even Lancashire as well, to be honest. How do you think it was all handled? Do you think it was done well?
I think the fact of the matter is that, I think I was somewhat surprised, because looking at the data, it looked like there were higher incidents in Nottingham, for example, when Liverpool City Region were selected to go into tier 3. So that didn't seem to follow through in terms of a logic. However, my view is that, the fact of the matter is that all of these areas geographically were on the rise. And, I come back to my point that I made earlier in relation to the circuit breaker request by SAGE. And really, if the scientists are basically saying we need to have a circuit breaker for 2 weeks, or 2 to 3 weeks, which was nationally, what and hindsight's a great thing now, I'm just like thinking, why wasn't that done? Because these tiered systems simply just seem to create a very, very, a lot of hostility, a lot of distrust, a lot of energy gone into that, rather than actually taking a strategic lead, saying, in actual fact, the virus is spreading, and we're not on top of this. And to be honest with you, just taking, if there are a couple of places in Oxfordshire or a few, places in, I don't know, Cornwall that haven't seen a rise. To be honest with you, I think a national circuit breaker was a far more sensible thing. So I think the tier system just confused everything. I think that, I think it was a national, or it was a government decision. I think, politicians were handed a pretty difficult sort of hand of cards, really, in terms of basically hearing about things secondhand, hearing it through the press. So I think communications, I just think it all seemed to be very last minute. So for me, I just think, there should have been far more strategic leadership right from the outset. Circuit breaker, we are where we are now. And I really didn't appreciate the fact that our businesses were worth, 20% less or 30% less than in terms of furlough. Our employees, and now that we're in national lockdown, we're back into 80%. And that's troubling, and it's worrying. So I think the tier system, has shown itself not to be a particularly great success. I think we should not go back to it. And I think if we're going to get on top of this, we need to get our test and trace, and we need to take a national approach to it.
I mean, if you live on the border of it, before Lancashire became a tiered area, you could be on the border of Merseyside and Lancashire, literally within a street. So people at the other end of your road didn't fall into the same restrictions as you, and you can understand why people must have been like, well, hang on a minute, this just doesn't make any sense. And then you've got the whole, you're allowed to see your bubble, or you're allowed to have childcare, but what happens if your bubble's not in the same borough as you? All of these questions just drive people bananas.
Well, I think, again, the public health message needs to be consistent. It needs to be trusted. It needs to be, and it needs to sort of, consistent and trusted, I think. needs to be a sort of, and a clarity attached to it. I think, not going back to, but yes, going back to, the situation with with government advisors going north with COVID and then going out to test their eyesight whilst they're driving, or driving somewhere to test their eyesight. I mean, I think that was a turning point. We've asked businesses what they thought, and they thought that was a turning point. It's like, is there another rule for somebody else? Because if there's one rule for us and there's another rule for another gang, that's not going to work. Then the second element is that there's layers and layers of different kind of messages. The fact of the matter is that one thing is that even in lockdown now, the question is that, do you have to go to work if you can't work at home? That's a judgment call.
Yeah.
Some people say, I don't feel as if I'm in a camp position, so I'm going to, there's a whole range of things. The idea of basically saying, eat out to help out. What a great initiative. The problem is that, we weren't over the second spike. So the idea of actually trying to, get to support, and I'd be the first to try and support the hospitality industry, but has that really helped them? Because now they have to close down again.
Yeah, and there was a very generalised mindset as well, sort of August, early September, that, well, we can eat out, so, lockdown's over kind of thing. So people thought that we were coming out. I mean, I know I personally thought we were on our way out the other side of it, and I had everything crossed that there wasn't going to be a second wave. And then since sort of the middle of September, we've just gone down and down.
And then the holiday period, it's like, advice about going away, what was going to be, acceptable to go away. The fact of the matter is that in the Republic of Ireland, I have family that live there still, and they're like saying, they were actively discouraging people from going on holiday. That wasn't the case here.
No.
Go on holidays, etc., etc. And the fact that it's just about inconsistency, a lack of clarity. And now we have layers and layers and layers. It's like, what's in the bubble, what's not in the bubble, and I mean, I have to say, I do feel sorry for Manchester, because they were in tier 2, I think, before us, and there were parts of Manchester where you were encouraged to go out, eat out to help out, but you couldn't be in the garden with your mum and dad, and but you could be out in the pub, standing beside somebody eating out to help out. These type of things are So logical things. Logic needs to play a game, or needs to be seen, I think, and we need to sort of play the logic game. And maybe, quick policy makes bad policy sometimes.
It's a tough one. So we're nearly out of time. So just as a very last question, and to end on a positive note, after quite a lot of serious conversation, when all this, whenever it may be, when all this is over and all the restrictions are lifted, what are you looking forward to doing the most?
It's seeing people in a group.
Yeah.
Just a gang. I think it's people, isn't it? It's people what you miss in terms of work, your colleagues. Of course, I miss travel. I don't know. I've missed a few little breaks away, which it's no hardship. I feel very lucky. I have a garden too, and all that kind of stuff. But I think it's people I miss most. And I think the other thing is that I just, the idea and the notion, on a positive note, is that people's lives will get better, and they'll be able to sort of rebound back, because there are, just some of the horror stories have been where, people have been ill and had to go to hospital, and, all that kind of stuff. So I'm just like, I'm thinking about it in terms of, a positive election result today in the United States. I think we want to sort of look forward to, getting on top of the pandemic, getting, wishing all the best to our scientists and our best thinkers in that field. And then on top of that, also really feeling about how we will be, I suppose it's about how we can, really learn from this. So I'm looking forward to, learning. I think I've learned some new tricks during pandemic, and I want to make sure that I keep them in my back pocket. So I think raising a glass with friends and those closest to me, more than 6 of them at the one time. And going and going out and, I'll support local hospitality in terms of having takeouts now, but, going out and actually experiencing that as well, that fear will be one of the key things. Yeah. And maybe having a little trip, abroad too, but first and foremost, it's about, first and foremost, it's about actually having a glass of wine with more than, one other person.
Brilliant. Oh, Maggie, thank you so much for joining us today for this conversation. It's been so interesting. I feel like I've kind of just sat and gone all the way through. You're just so insightful and so inspirational with everything that you said. So yeah, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Well, thanks to you, and hope you and the team, and I think onward and upward in terms of business. And I hope things. I don't know. Well, let's hope that Christmas is good to you. Yeah, and 2021 even better.
Absolutely. We'll get rid of. Is it quicker we can get rid of 2020, the better?
I think yes. I've no doubt about that.
That's a wish.
Goodbye, 2020. See you later. Well, on this occasion, yes, absolutely.
Yeah.